So hello everybody and welcome to our GTR panel today. I'm Rob Hersov in Cape Town and I'm in a motor vehicle parked in a parking lot, which I thought would be more interesting for you. I've got two incredible guests today and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Thea, you're first.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thea Fourie. I'm based in the IHS Markit Centurion office in South Africa, and I'm the team lead for the Sub-Saharan African region macro economy.
And Thea, you look like you're in the mountains, but is that a virtual background?
Unfortunately, yes, Rob, just a virtual background, still in the office and working from home, unfortunately.
And Robert, we've done this before. Excited to see you back. Tell us about yourself.
Absolutely, Rob. Very good to see you. Hi, Thea. Good to see you again as well. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the, I think we called it the GTR Carpool Karaoke, courtesy of Rob Hersov today. My name is Robert Besseling, Executive Director of Risk Advisory EXX Africa. We provide analysis and forecasts on political, economic, and security risk focused on the African continent. And it's a pleasure to be joining today.
So today we're going to do a hard-hitting back and forward, three of us. We're going to try and cover everything to do with Africa in 30 minutes or less. So, Robert, give me the 5 most investable countries in Africa today.
In that case, you're looking at your West and East African countries, the more diversified ones. So we're looking at Benin, Senegal, Rwanda, North Africa, potentially Morocco, and I'm going to pick a tricky one, Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. I know they've got some big elections coming up, but still the economic climate and the business climate seems quite benign. So that's my 5.
None in Southern Africa?
Definitely not for now, no. We can chat again in 2 years.
Wow. Thea, your view today, not pre-COVID, not post, today. Your 5.
Top investment countries. I have to share the view with Robert. I think East and West Africa definitely, but I do think in Southern Africa, one can add Mozambique to the list. And of course, in East Africa, your Kenyas, your Rwandas, West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire would also be on the top of my list.
And no Ethiopia, either of you. Don't answer that, but I might have Ethiopia in there. And I'm not going to ask your least investable because it's pointless, but which sectors, and now you don't have to cover those 5 countries, but which 3 sectors are going to really drive Africa over the medium term, 5 years? Thea.
The fact that our investors are more focused on ESGs, I do think any renewable green projects will be high on the priority for investment. But I do think digital economy, particularly health as well as education, one should not rule out.
So ed tech, health tech, and energy.
Yep.
You got my 3. You must be listening to me. You got my 3. Robert, do you agree? I mean, you can't not agree if 2 of us are on that platform.
Well, there's nothing really left, is there? I think public healthcare in the medium one, of course. Africa's ramping up public healthcare and private healthcare provision. I agree with tech and digital, of course, renewables as well. I think an interesting one to look at as well is in terms of digitization, also what effect it has on trade and also what it has on military procurement as well. We've seen quite a bit of military deals being done by African countries over the past few months. Potentially in anticipation of unrest. So I think it's also one to bring out in terms of export sectors.
That's interesting. Now that I haven't heard for a while, anyone raise that particular segment. So let's dive right into civil unrest and troubles and the political landscape. Where do you see the flashpoints, Robert? Where could we see problems coming out of COVID, unemployment, and bad policy?
It's essentially a storm coming together all at the same time. The idea of a perfect storm. We've got COVID-19. Some countries are dealing better than others. I think Senegal was recently rated as one of the best countries in the world of dealing with COVID-19. And others, don't have to name names or unless you probe, and other countries have certainly been more cautious and more controversial in terms of how they've been dealing with it. Then other countries have big elections coming up. Some of those countries, Thea and I mentioned earlier, in East and West Africa, all have elections coming up later this year or in 2021. And then corruption investigations, corruption allegations in a number of African countries, some of which relates to COVID-19 procurement. So that's your tinderbox scenario for a number of these African countries towards civil unrest.
What's interesting, though, is, you look at Zimbabwe. For so long, the people have been oppressed, and there's been bad governance and corruption, and the economy has collapsed, and yet the people don't rise up. And Africa is a relatively peaceful continent from that perspective. So where do you think this will come from, the unrest? Is it unhappiness with unemployment, the economy, or is it country against country, or is it tribal or religious?
Here you're looking mostly at your Arab Spring scenarios, where we've seen this time last year we saw Algeria, Sudan filling these type of scenarios, more recently Mali, and a number of other countries like Burkina Faso might still fall into the same category as well. What we're looking for here is not just the socioeconomic grievances. I think all African countries have socioeconomic grievances at the moment, but it's more the ability to stage these mass demonstrations. So in other words, unlike the Zimbabwean scenario, where the police actually allows demonstrations, strikes, any type of protests to occur, social media being able to mobilize supporters, and some sort of infrastructure in place, whether it's political parties, activists, key figures, which can actually lead these demonstrations. So there's no real blueprint, but those are some of the major factors to bring into consideration.
I know South Africa's bubbling at the moment. Yesterday was quite a heavy incident in a town called Senekal, where farmers, mostly white farmers, attacked the courthouse to try and get at two murderers, or they think they're murderers of a farmer. So things are really bubbling here. Thea, I want to ask you not about unrest, but I want to ask you about macro issues. We'll get to the economy now. The four big countries, the economies in Africa: South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt. Where are those four? Because are all four weak, or do we have any strength in those four?
So very briefly, Rob, South Africa, of course, battling due to the severe lockdown measures that's been implemented and the impact this had on economic activity and revenue flows of the government. If you look at Kenya's PMIs, a significant slump during the second quarter, but actually Kenya's PMI is above the 50 expansion level. We've seen resilient remittance inflows into Kenya, which has been helping this economy, and also actually terms of trade support a feature. Nigeria, growth slowing in the second quarter, but not as severe as in South Africa. Very, very significant fiscal constraints. 70% of government revenue now going towards debt servicing, which just shows the limited space for this economy to boost public sector investment going forward. So really the big ones suffering, unfortunately.
Robert, you like looking at credit. Are there any real potential big defaults, like sovereign defaults, in the big four and then the next group of countries?
In the big four, big sovereign defaults, I don't think we're looking at a likely scenario there in the, let's say, 6-month outlook. This will really depend whether the G20, IMF, World Bank actually renews, extends the DSSI debt relief, and whether some commercial creditors and Chinese creditors actually jump on board as well, because we need something a bit broader than the current bilateral Paris Club setup. So in terms of your big four, I think Kenya potentially is most likely to out of those four to reach a default in 2021, and that's mostly because of the Chinese railway debt that has been developed over the past few years, and which was unaffordable even pre-pandemic. So a restructuring was on the cards anyway there. So Kenya out of the big four. In terms of a shortlist beyond those, Republic of Congo and Zambia are very high up on our radar, and so is Chad. So 3 countries there which are more than likely in the short term, and beyond that, a couple of ones like Angola and Kenya, which are the more worrying big case scenarios.
Well, let's talk quickly about China debt. And the Chinese have put enormous loans into Africa. In return, they've got rights to exploit certain resources, mineral resources. Would China follow a debt default with any aggressive measures in your view?
China does not negotiate its debt through the IMF, through the DSSI. It does so through the BRI or through its own state-owned enterprises. So they do not participate. They've endorsed the G20 initiative, very tacitly so over the past 2 months. So they are not going to jump on the bandwagon there. That would lay open lots of deals which have not been transparent so far. In terms of actual repercussions, you know, just because a country defaults does not mean that the asset is lost. We've seen that in the cases of Argentina. We've seen that in cases in Ivory Coast in the past. The last time an African country had a sovereign default of a major scale, the asset is never lost. So for China, they would seek some kind of if a restructuring can't be done before a default, more than likely you'll have Chinese creditors seeking Chinese government support to tap into resources or key infrastructure as the restructuring of the structure of the deal. And we've seen that already happen in Zambia and a number of other African countries as well, where key infrastructure becomes part of the collateral, so to speak, of a loan.
So about 3 years ago, I used to use these numbers, which are very, very broad and rough, that foreign direct investment into Africa was around $50–60 billion. That aid into Africa was around $50 to $60 billion. That intra-Africa M&A was $50 billion. And which one am I missing? So we've got FDI, we've got aid, and remittances were also an enormous number, a little bit less. Isn't it interesting, those 4 pillars of flow, but only one is foreign direct investment. So let's talk about FDI. And Robert, maybe you can just give a quick view, and then I want to move to Thea. Where are we on FDI in Africa? Is it shifting? Is it constant? Has it reduced?
This goes back to the key sectors we were mentioning earlier. And both Thea and I, and you, Rob, we agreed on this, the key sectors where we've seen most of the investment during the pandemic. It has shifted away from your dirty energies like coal. It has shifted away to a certain extent from new infrastructure deals. It has shifted mostly towards public healthcare and towards renewable energy. And that's really where we've seen most of the activity over the course of 2020.
Thea?
Yes, of course, if you look at South Africa, for instance, the pipeline deals are, shockingly low. If you look at the preliminary numbers, and, South African government really needs the risk revival program to get the economy going. But there are some large-scale projects ongoing. Mozambique, you have this LNG commitment from Total, which is a, favorable development, although ExxonMobil not doing the, stepping back and pushing out the FIDs. And then other projects like oil pipelines in Rwanda, Tanzania, LNG developments in Nigeria. So some large projects continue to go on, but it is our view that the cash-strapped corporates will probably step back and be a little bit less reluctant to invest going forward, not only in Sub-Saharan Africa, but I think globally, and kind of right through this pandemic first to make any real commitments. And like I said, it's not just the Africa thing. I think it's a global development.
Fascinated by America. Sometimes I believe America has only been triggered into its action in Africa because the Chinese have been driving on all fronts. But on other days, I think America doesn't really care. They don't really care. They do enough to show a level of interest, but they really don't care. What's your view?
About the US?
And investing in Africa.
US, of course, trying very hard to get some trade deal with the US, between Kenya currently, making some effort in that regard. But ultimately, I think their investment on the continent has been declining for several years. And it's very, I think, a perception is reflection in the numbers. And I think also the overall political developments and policies that's being implemented in the US clearly shows that, nearshoring, bringing business back to the US is very out there. But ultimately, in the past few years, US investment in Africa has been declining if you look at the hard numbers.
I'd agree with that. I think there's an element of we'll do enough to be involved, but, we're okay. We don't need Africa, which means Africa has to really, once again, do it on its own. Politically, if you look at Africa, let's look Pan-Africa, some countries like Malawi seem to be heading in an amazing positive direction. There was a dispute at the ballot box of who won the election, went to the High Court, and the winner was decided. And the winner is an extraordinary man. I had a conversation with him. I think Malawi's on the move. Which other countries look like they're doing the right thing from a governance, election policy point of view?
Is that going to me, Rob?
Whoever put their hands up. Robert,
Sure.
go ahead.
I'll put my hand up quick. I think the Malawi example is interesting because Mr. Chakira, who recently won those elections and who you chatted to in Invest Africa, is certainly someone who's bringing back that idea that Africa's changing. Just like we had 2-3 years ago with Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, with Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, with João Lourenço in Angola, these new type of leaders come in. But we've been disappointed with all those three since that I just mentioned. So the optics very often are very different. Coming in as a new leader and changing a long-time incumbent usually comes with a breath of fresh air, promises, and campaign pledges, which are very often populist. Those are difficult to implement at the best of days, so let alone during a pandemic, and particularly a country like Malawi, which is very much cash-strapped already, very much dependent on donor aid, and doesn't really have that much export activity at the moment. So a country like Malawi, as the case study that you used, is probably going to struggle quite a bit in implementing those campaign pledges.
We take two case studies, and I was thinking Zambia and Tanzania as things going wrong. I mean, Zambia, you've just mentioned, could be a default candidate. What's going on in Tanzania? Is Magufuli completely mad, or is he inspirational? I don't understand it.
Well, both Edgar Lungu in Zambia and Joe Magufuli in Tanzania come from the same mold of African politician, potentially both inspired by Museveni in Uganda, in terms of having a heavy state role in the economy, an overbearing government presence, and a very centralized administration. In Tanzania, the main controversy during the pandemic has been the denying of an outbreak of COVID-19 in Tanzania. And we've seen in Tanzania most of the testing stopping since, I believe it was around May. So if you look at the charts, the interminable data we see on COVID-19 in Africa, Tanzania stopped producing it completely. And it's not because they don't rely on data, it's simply because they believe that the pandemic is over, has skipped Tanzania. So that is a big controversy. And just like with some of the countries we're talking about earlier, it's a big problem for donors as well, because it's not just investors we need at the moment. It's also the big overseas development aid, budgetary support that we require for African countries to get through this pandemic. And by denying there is COVID-19 in Africa or in your particular country, you're not doing yourself any real favors.
Another topic that interests me is Mauritius. As a financial center, Mauritius has more bilateral agreements with countries in Africa than any other African country. And I think Belgium and the UK are probably next. But Mauritius has been put on the naughty step by America recently. Where does Mauritius go from here? And then, Thea, I'm going to switch to you to ask you about Cape Verde, if you have an opinion. Robert, Mauritius?
The European Union has blacklisted a number of African countries: Ghana, Botswana, Seychelles, Mauritius, and that's because the EU is going heavy on anti-money laundering legislation and implementation of AML rules. That's okay so far because many of these countries are actually ramping up their AML and fraud legislation. Seychelles is doing so as we speak. Mauritius might still make the deadline. For Mauritius at the moment, they're facing a bit of a backlash locally in terms of the massive slump in tourism exports, tourism revenues, as well as the perceived mishandling of the recent oil spill, which triggered some protests in Port Louis in Mauritius for the first time in years, to be quite honest, or decennia. So Mauritius is going through a bit of a political shift, and definitely is one of the hardest hit countries, economically speaking, throughout Africa.
So Thea, I wasn't going to tease you and throw Cape Verde at you because very few people know anything about it, but I've heard that Cape Verde is moving very fast to try and be a competitor to Mauritius. I don't know if you have a view on that, or maybe where are the financial centers in Africa that are on the go, on the rise?
So, of course, Cape Verde is one of those small economies that has made such huge inroads in governance, right? Absolutely phenomenal, you know, what they've achieved. And on the island, really trying to introduce renewable projects and to enhance the infrastructure, which unfortunately has pushed up their debt levels, and being reliant on tourism as a source of external liquidity, it of course places them in a difficult position. And also the fact that they're a middle income country means that they don't always have access to those kind of concessional debt that they would hope for. But they've been a country doing the right thing for a long time. And I think long term, it obviously will benefit them. Looking at financial developments, of course, South Africa, the financial leader on the continent, but not for fintech. And that is where you look at your Kenyas and your East African region, which continues to outperform in that sense. Even West Africa, you know, catching up, but I think East Africa continues to be the leaders in the fintech developments with the M-Pesa programs. But solid fundamentals for financial market in South Africa. If you look at our commercial banks, and I think one country that you can never take off the radar in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, let's talk about South Africa. I'd love to get your view there. We'll just do 1 minute each. Is South Africa investable right now? Can it be in the future, or is it heading in the wrong direction?
Definitely, we need the post-COVID-19 budget and reform program to succeed. Otherwise, I do think in the near term, with our electricity constraints, with our labor actions that's going to happen today, it's going to be a difficult sell.
Robert, South Africa, thumbs up.
It's a huge question, but potentially huge answers. I think I'm going to focus on one key word, and that's corruption. Because what we've seen over the past few months in terms of COVID-19 related corruption has given a shock to the current government, potentially a shock we all needed, as well as legacy corruption from the previous administration. This current government is talking pro-business, pro-investment, trying to make deals with labor unions, trying to restructure those debt-strapped state-owned enterprises, but is not implementing it fast enough. It needs to shake up a number of the echelons of the ruling party, and potentially by addressing recent corruption and legacy corruption, it might have an opportunity to do so. Wishful thinking, perhaps, but it's an opportunity nevertheless.
But on the corruption stake, you know, people in South Africa think Nigeria invented it. South Africa's perfected it, corruption. What about Nigeria? Investable or not?
I'm just going to jump in there and say Nigeria actually has gone through some major reform processes over the past few months. They are pushing ahead with absolutely crucial oil sector regulations, reform of the oil sector law for the first time in 20 years. This current Nigerian government has been able to phase out fuel subsidies, which no government has been able to do for 15 years. They've got to deal with the IMF, which was unheard of a few months ago. Similarly, they've been making various different currency reforms and other more positive, at least from an investor, for a foreign investor perspective. Nigeria is using this crisis to push through some really difficult reforms at very quite difficult times.
Such a good. I'm glad you raised this. Yeah, Thea, go ahead. Sorry.
Of course, the largest economy on the continent as well, so you cannot really ignore this. But at the same vein, I would just like to mention Angola as well, and what you mentioned, Robert. I think one should not discard what the Angolan government has achieved. Free floating exchange rate under extreme difficult conditions, introducing a privatization program, also looking at subsidies next year. So a lot of difficult things being done in Angola as well, and I know probably we would have hoped some more progress on corruption, but some movement there as well. So I do think that's another country that one should acknowledge what they have achieved in a relatively short period of time.
You know what, I'm so glad Robert, you raised that on Nigeria, and Thea, you raised that on Angola. I think we need to create a media company or a newsletter or a podcast on good news in Africa, because it gets lost and we lose a lot of these great things that are happening. So I'm really glad you raised that. One segment that we never ever talk about is mining, only because mining industry has been around for so long. It's so established. It's been a long bear run. What's happening in mining and where are the bright spots? And there are a few. Thea, do you want to have a crack at that?
So in South Africa, for instance, Renegan is going to do a development in, I can't remember what the commodity is, but there is some developments there in South Africa. Definitely Zambia, very difficult with the legislation ongoing, even Namibia. So the weaker commodity prices makes it a little bit difficult to really support mining expansion currently. But LNG developments in Mozambique, moving forward, still a lucrative opportunity. So there's really focusing on which commodity, at what price going forward. So I think it's the commodity prices that's probably a little bit of a drag on activity in this segment of the economy.
Robert, mining, you got a view on that?
I'm going to disagree on this one, Thea, because I think mining in Africa is going for gold at the moment, literally. If you look at a couple of the key commodity prices, investors are looking for safe haven assets, and gold has been one of them over the past few months. And even though South Africa has not been able to capitalize that much on it, a number of other countries like Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, various other ones as well, have been able to kind of offset the losses in other sectors. Like Ghana has got hugely hit by the drop in oil prices and gas prices, but gold prices have been able to offset that. And then the copper prices seem to be, well, they're certainly volatile, but any semblance of a pickup of Chinese economic activity will shoot up those copper prices as well. And that's good news for the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's very good news also for Zambia, which really needs these revenues. So it's a mixed bag, I certainly agree, but there's a few commodities out there within the mining sector, within extractives, which are actually doing quite well at the moment.
Yeah, but I think the problem is really, you have to ask yourself if the market hasn't run it ahead of itself, right? I do agree gold is of course a good hedge, but I think the view of IHS Markit, there's a big risk that the commodity prices has run himself ahead, and that they probably could start to stabilize. And I do think, or even come down a little bit, and I do think that is factored in some investment decisions.
So what I want to do is do one more theme, and then we're going to have a little bit of fun. The last theme is population. You know, everybody says one of Africa's great benefits, and there are many, it's agricultural, blah, blah, is population. You know, there's so many babies, and Nigeria is having more babies than the whole of Europe put together. And it's a dividend, and it's going to create a consumer market. But who's going to employ these people? Where are the jobs going to come from? You know, who's going to educate them? Where are the budgets for that? What's your view on this? Everybody says it's such a good thing. I'm not so sure. Thea?
Well, Rob, in fact, South Africa do not have an open demographic dividend. I think that is not a true reflection, because the dependency rate in Africa will only start to fall by 2050 for a lot of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. We have a young population, but we don't have an open demographic dividend. And you're absolutely right. This will become a social issue unless we are able to supply jobs to a young population which is far better educated than the previous ones, and in far more wired into social issues via the mobile phones and the tech that has developed with it. So it can become a big problem if Africa do not have the ability to provide jobs going forward. And in my view, a big risk factor to watch going forward.
Robert?
A fast-growing young population is very often seen as a big asset, but that's only when GDP per capita goes up. Otherwise, it's certainly not. There's an idea that the Chinese development model can be copied in Africa. We mentioned Ethiopia earlier, and they've come the closest out of any African government in actually implementing those long-term development plans. The problem is that African governments don't have the capacity to manage within their own borders very often in big countries, not able to deal with urbanization, or to actually bring up GDP per capita, to let economic growth match population growth. So then we come to rely on the entrepreneurial spirit of some of the African countries that we've been talking about. Thea, you mentioned Kenya earlier, brilliant example of where we're seeing young, urban populations setting up new ventures, even during this COVID era, new apps, new ways to get around lockdown regulations, etc. Lagos is doing exactly the same thing. These are major hubs of entrepreneurial spirit. Then, yeah, the young population can be an asset, but let's not kid ourselves that African governments can deal with the huge assets, supposed assets of a young, angry, arising population.
Agree.
Now we're going to have a little bit of fun. We each throw a question on the table, see how it goes. So my question to the two of you is, where would you most like to go on holiday in Africa, and what would the holiday be? You got 10 days on holiday. Thea, where would you go?
I'll go to Namibia because it's one of my favorite destinations on the continent. And I'm not used to deserts and that kind of environment, climate. So I must say Namibia is quite a favorite on my holiday calendar.
Robert, where would you go?
I really thought Thea was going to say the Drakensberg in South Africa, considering the beautiful vista behind her. Rob, I'm on the south coast of South Africa at the moment. I had a walk on the beach this morning before our call. So to be quite honest with you, I'm perfectly happy where I am. I don't really want to go anywhere right now. So I'm going to say staycation. Perfect.
Well, I want to go to Rwanda, Lake Kivu, and then the gorillas. That's the holiday I'd take.
Oh.
So Thea, what's your question? You got to throw one at the two Roberts. Come on, anything fun.
So informal question, right? Gosh, I have to think fast now. Where do you guys think the biggest surprises in Africa is going to come from, and what is it going to be? What is going to surprise us about Africa?
Can I go first? I think the DRC. I think the DRC is on the move. Felix Tshisekedi is doing a lot of the right things. I think Kabila's starting to disappear. And I have hope for that big old hole in Africa that's called the DRC. I feel positive.
As an original Belgian, I certainly hope to share the same sentiment towards the DRC. I like the way you're mentioning mostly the people you've recently interviewed, Rob. In terms of, I think it's back to the population. I think the African population itself is going to surprise us. And it goes back to the idea of uprisings, to do what we were talking about earlier. A number of countries have got elections coming up. A number of those elections are not, well, should not even be held under the current environment. Some of them have very controversial third-term bids. And political oppression happening. So there's a real scenario that we can see another Mali, we can see another Algeria or Sudan, I'd say even within the next few weeks, if not months, in a number of these countries. So I think, not picking on one country, but I'm saying an African population, specifically in the cities, can actually surprise us quite heavily in the next few weeks or months.
And Robert, you've got a question to throw on the table. Now it's your turn. Have you got one?
You asked a question earlier, but didn't actually want us to respond to it in terms of which countries do you actually think are not going to come well out of this at all. So I'm not talking about the Somalias or the Libyas, which are already stuck in difficult situations, but which countries in Africa could potentially surprise us by not coming well out of the pandemic?
To me, Madagascar, I think it's heading down. Sadly, I think South Africa is in very bad shape and worse than most people think. And the will to fix it is, the will might be there in one person, but around him, there is none whatsoever. There's no talk of economic growth. It's steal, break, take. Entitlement. One more bad one. I think that's two's enough. It's too depressing. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I share your view on South Africa, but I think you can add Zambia to that list as well, Robert. I think things are are really on the verge of default, and they're vulnerable to climate change. There's ups and downs, electricity supply, agricultural losses. So I do think in the end, also due to politics, it's not going to be a good story.
I agree.
And the last question.
Oh, yeah, go on, Rob. I just was going to say that I agree with Zambia, but on South Africa part, I'm a little bit more skeptical. In terms of people you recently interviewed, Rob, I think Mr. Paul Mashatile might be quite a wild card, someone to watch over the next few months, next year or so, in terms of potentially taking the helm or pushing through new reforms in South Africa. Sorry, back over to you.
No, he's a nice man. He's a nice man. You're right. Okay, the final thing is, just tell me one or two wonderful, happy, positive things about Africa for our audience. And I'll go first, just to give you a chance to think. There is a young black golfer, he's a teenager at best, who is winning tournaments. And I would love to see someone from Africa be competing for some of the great tournaments around the world. And secondly, my dream is that an African gets into the top 100 grandmasters in chess. That would make me very, very happy. Who wants to go next? Something nice and happy.
The weather.
Yeah. The weather's good.
I think the weather is something good about Africa, but I also think the world was surprised in how we handled COVID. And I think we actually didn't do a bad job. And everybody was doom and gloom and saying, whoa, Africa, you're not going to make it. And I think we surprised them. And actually, for the first time in a long time, where Africa worked together. And I think that was a good development. We had engagement across Africa, and that to me was surprising. And I think that surprised the world, and that we should be acknowledged for that.
Good for you. Robert?
Yeah, I'm Thea. I've actually at the same point lined up as well. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were all looking at these nightmare scenarios. The world's most vulnerable continent is going to be hit the hardest from a healthcare perspective, a public emergency, a calamity, and an economic perspective. Well, we're all still sitting here. I believe all three of us sitting in South Africa today, we have been able to deal with this crisis, been able to throw some positivity into the wind as well. And we've been able to deal with various crises in the past. Rob, you mentioned Zimbabwe earlier, an endless array of crises, one after the other. But in the end, throughout the African continent, there are lots of examples of people dealing with this relatively well, making a plan, so to speak, and moving on with life. Final
thing, Robert, would you rather sing or dance in public?
I can't do either, so it depends on how much red wine I've had.
Thea?
Well, I'll dance, but I think I'll help as well.
I'll sing. Thea and Robert, you've been fantastic. That was a lot of fun. You can come back anytime. And thank you, GTR. Bye, everyone.